Hello and welcome to the Regulation Asia Awards for Excellence 2020 video series. I'm Elliott Gotkine. Now, back in December, I hosted the awards ceremony and there were a number of firms recognised. One of the biggest awards was for Market Infrastructure of the Year. In this category, a company that provides post-trade market infrastructure for the global financial services industry was recognised. That company was DTCC. Priya Kundamal is General Manager and Head of DTCC Data Repository Singapore, who joins me now. Great to see you, Priya.
Thank you, Elliott, and thank you, Regulation Asia. I'm happy to be here and excited to discuss derivatives trade reporting with you today.
Congratulations again on the award. Judges said that one of the hallmarks of your global trade repository service is DTCC's commitment to continuous improvement through close collaboration with regulators and market participants. And earlier this year, DTCC published a new perspectives paper with this continuous improvement objective in mind. Can you tell us a bit more about the challenges in global trade reporting that your paper is seeking to address?
Let me begin by reviewing the progress that the industry has made with trade reporting. Over the last decade, individual jurisdictions have not been achieving standardization in trade reporting that enables regulators to reach the level of transparency and global risk monitoring in the over-the-counter OTC derivatives markets as originally envisioned by the Group of 20, as known as the G20. Because of this fragmentation in reporting and data requirements across jurisdictions, we see challenges around the global aggregation and analysis of OTC derivatives transaction data reported to trade repositories like ourselves. This essentially means a lack of transparency across jurisdictions that could hinder regulators' ability to adequately monitor systemic risk. In our perspectives paper that was published in March this year, DTCC outlined our recommendations to achieve global data harmonization in the OTC derivatives market.
And from DTCC's perspective, what would you say needs to be done to ensure there is greater transparency in monitoring for systemic risk across the industry?
From DTCC's perspective, greater standardization in OTC derivatives trade reporting would enable the regulators to reach the level of transparency and global risk monitoring that was identified critical during the G20 summit back in 2009. Now, with several trade reporting rule sets currently under regulatory review, this is the perfect time for industry to collaborate in meeting the objective of achieving global data harmonization. Specifically, individual jurisdictional trade reporting rules need to be aligned to facilitate global market transparency, and the industry should consider harmonizing trade reporting across jurisdictions. To promote data harmonization, regulatory bodies are now embarking on the adoption of critical data elements, which is known as CDE, for derivatives trade reporting as identified by CPMI and IASCO, and also by the Harmonization Group. Adoption of these standards is the right approach towards increasing transparency across jurisdictions. However, because regulatory bodies have not completely aligned on the reporting standards that they require, the G20's risk mitigation objectives cannot be achieved, and market participants will face complex implementation burdens. So as each jurisdiction implements rules, updates, and changes that don't align in terms of standard data elements, firms, market participants remain in a cycle of updating their reporting systems to meet new rules that don't lead to a common data set across jurisdictions. This is both operationally inefficient and fails to achieve the original goal of transparency across global jurisdictions.
And as you say, regulatory fragmentation has been a persistent challenge for the industry. So how does DTCC reckon that greater harmonization of data sets can actually be achieved across jurisdictions?
We need to have a holistic view of this industry. With that in mind, as I mentioned earlier, we published our perspectives paper this year, where we set out 3 key areas which need to be looked at to build that global view. First is to reduce jurisdictional differences. Second is to adopt a common message standard. And third is to support a common governance structure. When we talk about reducing jurisdictional differences, we mean that the industry and regulators need to continue to work together to successfully adopt the critical data elements, the CDEs, which is a list of 110 data fields that were selected and standardized by the CPMI and IOSCO. This process of adoption is already underway in Australia, as well as in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, where consultations are now underway. On messaging standards, we think the way forward is to agree to use the ISO 20022 as a common data standard and format for reporting to trade repositories. There's still some work to do to finalize the standard for the CDE messages, but the resulting work will be perfectly fit for purpose and be based on the tried and trusted ISO framework. But regarding governance, we think we need to support the LEI, Regulatory Oversight Committee, which has proved effective in governing the LEI, in taking over the governance of the Universal Product Identifiers, the UPIs, and the Universal Transaction Identifiers, the UTIs. The Financial Stability Board, the FSB, has also already endorsed them, and we think that the industry should throw its weight behind it too.
And you touched on this just now, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the critical data elements for derivatives trade reporting that were identified by CPMI and IOSCO?
The CPMI IOSCO several years ago formed the Harmonisation Group to actually devise standardized terminology and identify which of these CDE of swaps are most important on the economics of the trade. So regardless of where these trades are reported. So this was actually done in response to the issue that I talked about earlier on, the cross-jurisdictional specific trade reporting rules and standards resulting in fragmented data sets, which in turn impede regulators' ability to see and supervise systemic risk. They've come down to a final list of CDE, 110 items, but the adoption of these CDE is still under the remit of the local regulatory authority. What do I mean by that? So the regulatory bodies are currently embarking on this adoption of the CDEs as identified by the CPMI IOSCO Harmonization Group. This in turn was designed to promote data harmonization, which is critical to data aggregation and transparency across jurisdictions, which again aligns to the G20's risk mitigation objectives. Unfortunately, regulators' efforts fall short of aligning trade reporting rules across the globe. Disparate adoption of CDE by each jurisdiction is operationally inefficient and fails to achieve the global goal of transparency across the global jurisdictions. So DTCC is recommending that policymakers identify a universal short list of CDEs for trade reporting in order to have easy access or views across multiple jurisdictions, as well as domestically, and must enforce CDEs to be universally and uniformly adopted by all regulators, with additional jurisdictional non-CDE fields if a particular regulator determines additional data is necessary to meet their local mandate.
With rule rewrites either taking place or expected to take place in the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, what are DTCC's recommendations for regulators?
The key recommendation is to keep engaging with other regulators, the industry, and other stakeholders to eliminate cross-jurisdictional differences in the adoption of CDE trade reporting requirements. From a technical standpoint, the adoption of a common message standard on a uniform timeframe would further drive efficiencies in overall global implementation. From a DTCC point of view, we don't have a view on whether a regulator should mandate the ISO 20022 mandate, but we do think if there's an ISO message based on CDE, then it makes sense for ISO to be adopted.
Do you expect other regulators in Asia will embark on similar initiatives?
There is a steady and gradual shift to decrease jurisdictional differences in OTC reporting across the region. As you can see, ASIC and MAS have released their consultation papers proposing changes to simplify their derivatives rules. Japan and Hong Kong have started the process to adopt CDE. So there is an increased level of regional discussions taking place across the APAC regulators in collaboration towards harmonization of trade reporting requirements. This is again evidence in the focus on driving the adoption of a standardized UTI aimed at segging into greater regulatory harmonization. APEC regulators have been engaging in active discussions to ensure that the UTI rollout is harmonized across the APEC region. DTCC believes that adhering to global standards will allow a clean and more efficient implementation in the use of UTI. This is particularly important for firms with global footprints. Following guidance issued by the CPMI and IOSCO on harmonizing UTI, the adoption of global standards for the eventual UTI implementation is likely to happen in Australia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and Japan.
And I mean, how would the changes that you're suggesting affect market participants in Asia, and how should they be preparing right now?
I think key points I want to leave with the group here today. My key message is seize this moment and get involved. The changes, the significant scale of changes are coming, and we all need to play our part. So on our side in DTCC, the global rule rewriting, refitting and rule changes is a critical part of the evolution of trade reporting we are at right now. As the rules are rewritten, we can either seize that moment to implement everything in a globally consistent manner, especially for the core data elements that I mentioned, the CDE, that describes the economics of the trade as much as we can, so that the regulators end up able to do their job, or we will end up losing that moment that we have right now. So from a DTCC perspective, we are looking at the rule changes, the consultations very, very closely and providing very thoughtful comments back to the regulators, which balances their jurisdictional needs while also driving forward the need for global consistency and global data harmonization. Improving the derivatives trade reporting regime is and will continue to be a global industry-wide effort. So from a market participant's point of view, they need to be engaged in this process as well. At this stage, we are encouraging them all to seek to participate in industry consultations, which will allow them to better understand regulators' priorities and the scope of changes in detail. And of course, they will have the opportunity to provide their input. And firms should prepare for the implementation of these changes over the next 2 to 3 years as the changes gets rolled out, for which we as the trade repositories are ready to support them.
Thanks so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and your insights, Priya. Really appreciate your joining us. That was Priya Kundamal, General Manager and Head of DTCC Data Repository, Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliott.